Hi, my name is Cameron. Today I'll be presenting on interracial marriages and race conflict theory. First, we'll cover our sexual variation, which is interracial marriage. Next, we will discuss our theory, which will be race conflict theory. After that, we will go over the historical and contemporary views of the variation. And lastly, I'll conclude with my personal opinion. So let's get started, shall we? Interracial marriage is the privilege to marry outside of one's race. It historically put Americans and their rights in the crosshairs of discriminatory systems upheld by socioeconomic and political actors of influence. This theory addresses the disconnect between legislation and social sciences. Through race and conflict theory, we can theoretically forge a deeper understanding of interracial marriages and, in turn, remedy societal power imbalances and increase social tolerance. Here we have race conflict theory and three of its prominent principles. Race conflict theory is defined, though, as a scope that studies how racial inequality is enacted upon marginalized groups by way of the dominant society through social, political, and economical efforts. Racial identity highlights the capacity in which a member understands race and the methods used by that member to express their membership of that race. Historically, we've always highlighted double consciousness by Du Bois because it shows the perception part of identity and echoes the idea that of the Black American identity and its comparative relationship to white America. Here we have racial formation. Racial formation is dominant society's social system to maintain power. Structural racism is a good model to understand how formation affects us. Simply put, a system to keep power away from non-white Americans was redlining. It was racial, restrictive covenants between private white property owners to lock black people out of select neighborhoods. Other examples include the war on drugs with a harsh sentencing discrimination ratio of 100-1, and the famous counterintelligence program that the FBI used to neutralize the Black Liberation Party. Next, we have racial resistance, which is the response of marginalized groups in an effort to cause change of condition. The 1947 case, Mendez v. Westminster, shows racial resistance because Mexican-American families succeeded in the courts for the same agency prescribed to white Americans. Scholars and theorists acknowledge this precedent setting the stage for the landmark Brown v. Board case, which desegregated public schools. Today, the best example of racial resistance are that of the anti-ICE protests, given the deportations are seen as a racial discrimination against non-white residents. So let's discuss the historical viewpoint. Jim Crow laws are prevalent across the nation, with the Supreme Court upholding the separate but equal ruling. Anti-miscegenation efforts were vicious. The murder of Emmett Till is an example of how careful black people had to be to survive. The civil rights movement accepted the sexual variation and used it towards gaining equal rights. Religion was split on the subject. White evangelicals aligned with dominant society to condemn the action. Blacks, on the other hand, were divided on the matter. Black Protestant leaders accepted the variation and was militarized to fight white supremacy. The Nation of Islam, which is a Muslim group consisting of black Americans, did not contest the variation but have always held a separatist position in dealing with white power. The conflict embodies the theory. The era forced black people to operate according to the double consciousness standard. That was so because of all the structural racism the black Americans were facing. And lastly, the actions taken to combat the oppression, like sit-ins, boycotts, and marches, are all forms of resistance. The contemporary views. We have the Gallup polls, which shows that overall it is believed to be an accepted sexual variation. with blacks traditionally being supportive and whites somewhat coming around after decades of protests. With the help of social media and online dating, technology has opened doors for interracial dating, relationships, and marriage. Online courting is at an all-time high with millions of users across several platforms. The media portrayal of interracial marriage is constant. The media stays spamming that representation option. Contemporary, the theory explains why the variation is socially accepted through representation in media. In summation, we introduced and defined both interracial marriages and race conflict theory. We also discussed three core tenets of race conflict theory, being racial identity, racial formation, and racial resistance. We covered the distance of the civil rights era, fast forwarded to today. In conclusion, interracial marriages became a race conflict issue because it challenged the racial hierarchy in society, was restricted through anti-miscegenation laws, and eventually led to legal and social resistance that helped overturn those very laws. The laws were amended to legalize it, but the social paradigm, through its structural racism, has made no significant change. Similar to the Voting Rights Act being passed in 1964, even though the 14th Amendment did the exact same thing a century prior. This is what federal benign neglect looks like. Also, scholars and scientists argue no effort for multiracial groups to emulate whiteness, but categorize multiracial agency as white adjacent, which leads me to believe that in 100 years, we'll be talking about the same thing. Once again, my name is Cameron, and this is a presentation on race, conflict theory, and interracial marriages. Thank you for your time.